Good evening, everyone. There we go. Thank you for patiently waiting. Hope you did enjoy the food, though, while you were waiting. My name is Jenna Ledke. I am a director at the Rumi Forum, which is located actually in Washington, D.C., our sister organization here. The American Turkish Friendship Association is hosting the event tonight, but it is a joint event that we are putting on for you. And if you received the email or the invitation for this event, I just do a little reminder here. If you received it from some other source besides ATFA or Rumi Forum, but you'd like to get event information later, you would need to sign up on our websites for that. So atfa.us and Rumi Forum, all one word, .org. And you can receive newsletters and event information, our blog posts as well. So before we get started, just a couple things. If you can turn your cell phones either on silent or off. I know that's difficult, but maybe we could try it. Experiment. But anyway, yeah, if it could be on silent, that would be optimal. So we are taping, I can see, this event, and so that tells me that most likely it will be up on our YouTube channel, Rumi Forum YouTube channel. Does Atfa have a YouTube channel? No. Okay, so not on Atfa's YouTube channel. That'll be coming in the future, hopefully. So, but on Rumi Forum's YouTube channel, probably within a week. So, all right. Pim Valkenberg, dear friend. We have both been here roughly the same amount of time. Moved roughly the same time in 2006. I at the end of February and Pim in the spring, I believe, right?
Summer. Yeah.
Summer.
Yeah.
Okay, summer. And so we go back a ways. So, but I would like to, if you'll allow me, I'd like to read Pim's bio for you, and then we can get started with his talk. And that will follow, by the way, with a Q&A session. So Dr. Valkenberg is professor of religion at the Catholic University of America. He previously worked for the Diocese of Breda, am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
As a specialist on adult education, and for the Netherlands School of Advanced Studies in Theology and Religion as a research fellow. He was an assistant and associate professor of dogmatic theology and the theology of religions at the Catholic University of Nijmegen. Okay. I'm sure I just slaughtered that. Okay. Where he studied Arabic and Islam as well. He contributed to the establishment of a new Department of Religious Studies in 1991 with a focus on interreligious dialogue. And as Associate Dean of Education between 1999 and 2004, he was responsible for the development of new programs of intercultural theology and pastoral studies. Between 2006 and 2011, he was a visiting professor and an associate professor of theology at Loyola University with a focus on Christian-Muslim relations. So with that, I'll hand it to him. He is going to speak with us this evening, of course, about his book, Renewing Islam, My Service, A Christian View of Fethullah Gulen and the Hizmet Movement. I believe we have books for sale tonight.
I believe so too.
Yes,
Yeah.
right? Okay, I would hope so. I would hope so. And so you can see myself afterwards. I'm sure Pim would, put his John Hancock on a few if you'd like. And but you can see myself, my colleague Rashid, who's at the helm of the camera here.
No.
For the sale of the book. So, okay.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I knew Fairfax as a place where really many Muslims live, and very often we have been to Fairfax, I believe, a couple of times because Rumi Forum, together with the School of Theology and Religious Studies of the Catholic University of America, had a kind of a dinner group that came together a couple of times, and some of them were in Fairfax. So that's the only other time I've been to Fairfax. But I believe that the cover of my book has Alpha, Virginia, I'm not sure, is it Fairfax or?
It is.
Oh, it has it on the cover because I chose this idea of the Ramadan tent a couple of years ago as the picture that, to my opinion, expresses best the idea of the title of my book, Renewing Islam by Service. So what I would like to do in introducing the book a little bit is probably the best is to first tell a bit more about how I came to know the people inspired by Fethullah Gulen. Then I want to talk a bit about when I started to write the book, the research that I did in Izmir, and why I think that is interesting for at least some of the people inspired by him to learn about some of these stories. Then I want to talk a bit about why my book is a bit different, I guess, than most of the other books about Hajj Effendi, Fethullah Gulen, and about the Hizmet movement. And then in the end I will want to try to give one or two examples of what I found the most important findings in my research. So let me begin by talking a bit about how I met the people from the Hizmet movement. The funny thing is, as so often happens, it's not because of me, but it was because of my wife, who worked as a pastoral, I think the term here would be a pastoral life director in a couple of parishes in Nijmegen, the city where we lived and where I worked at the university. She was invited by a Muslim friend to come to an iftar dinner. And of course you know, it's now well known, the iftar dinners, as a special occasion in which Muslims invite people from other religions and maybe from non-religion at all, which is certainly in the Netherlands a big group, to attend a dinner and to experience a bit of what Muslims do when they fast during Ramadan, but also the social event in the breaking of the fast. So I was invited, together with my wife, to go there, and I met one of the persons of the local group of what was then called, I believe, the Gulen movement in the Netherlands. He was one of the persons who founded the Islam and Dialogue Foundation, as they call it in the Netherlands. And we got to talk, and I was looking, because of my work in Nijmegen, I was looking to find dialogue partners, because I was, as a Christian theologian working in a Catholic university, I was interested in interreligious dialogue, and I wanted my students to experience the dialogue with people from other religions. At that time, that was quite new. I'm talking about the beginning of the 1990s now. And he was one of the first that I met, and I met a couple of other people in the Netherlands from the Hizmet movement, and they struck me as people who were very good to bring into contact with my students, because on the one hand they were very clearly Muslims, in the sense that they were living as Muslims. It was not just, let's say, kind of an intellectual thing, but it was important in their entire lives. But on the other hand, they were very open to go into communication and go in dialogue with people of other religions, and more specifically Christianity, which of course is the religion of the majority in the Netherlands. Another point was that you may know that in Europe, let's say the history of immigrants, of course we're all talking about immigrants and immigration now, the history of immigrants, Muslim immigrants, is really different, I would say, from the history of Muslim immigrants in the United States. Most of the immigrants in the United States were attracted to the United States, and they were welcome in the United States because they were highly educated and because they were trained in let's say architecture, engineering, doctors, etc., etc. In the Netherlands or in France or in Germany, Great Britain is a little bit different, they were coming as guest workers. They were coming as manual laborers. So they came on their own, not bringing their family. Their families came only later, but they were not intellectual because they didn't need the intellect, they needed the hands, okay? So they are, so to say, the blue-collar workers. But it was the second and then the third generation of these immigrants that also got to develop themselves intellectually and educationally, and therefore they became the kind of Muslims who would be good partners for my students to get into dialogue with. So that's how I met the Hizmet movement in the Netherlands. And then indeed when I came to the United States, one of the coordinators of the movement there was a good friend of Ali Yurtsever, who was at that time the director of Rumi Forum. So he said, well, I'll introduce me to my good friend Ali. And so Ali and Jenna were almost the first people that I met in the United States, because I knew almost no one when we came to the United States. We were immigrants as well. So we went to, was it Arlington? It was in Virginia. Oh, McLean, okay. And we met with them for the first time. So it was kind of continuing the relationship that I already had in the Netherlands with Rumi Forum. So let me get to the second point that I wanted to tell you, which is a bit more about the research that I did for this book. So the same Ali Yurtsever asked me a couple of years later whether I wanted to write a book about Hajj Effendi, Fethullah Gülen, and he proposed that I would go together with a group of people from Maryland, a small group of some 10 scholars and some political personalities, to visit some of the places of the movement in Istanbul, in Izmir, in Konya even, in Cappadocia. So we went around, but before that, together with my friend whom I just mentioned in the Netherlands, with whom I collaborated a lot, he was from Izmir, and he knew some of the oldest friends, or the oldest students, if you want, of Fethullah Gülen, because the movement started in Izmir in the 1970s. That was the moment that Hajj Effendi was a kind of a teacher in the Kestan Basri Quran school, and I met some of the people who knew him from that period, and I was interested in knowing what was it that attracted you to Fethullah Gülen. Why was he convincing you that you could start a new movement with him? So I interviewed them about how they met Hajj Effendi, what they did together, but mainly I was interested in hearing from them, how did he get the, let's say, the spark in your soul burning? That might be a good way to express what happened. So now I know only a couple of words of Turkish. I mean, my Arabic is not good, but my Turkish is even worse. I tried to learn it a couple, so probably I should go to one of the Turkish lessons. But of course the problem is Turkish is not an Indo-European language. It's also not a Semitic language, and I know some of that. It's really different. So I tried, and I know a couple of words, but I couldn't interview the people. So what happened was my friend, with whom I talked Dutch, he talked Turkish with these friends, and he translated it into Dutch for me, and I wrote it down in English. Okay, so that's 3 different languages. Yeah. So that's how this book came into being, and I think the other thing that might be as important as that is we listened together to a number of sermons of Hajj Effendi, because I noticed that for many of the older students of Fethullah Gülen, the books are good, but the sermons are the real thing. They really like to listen to the sermons. And now still in Hercule, you still have these sermons, and they listen to these tapes. And nowadays, of course, you have them on DVD. So my friend bought this cassette with, I think, 33 DVDs with all the vast Kuliati, so all the sermons that Hajj Effendi held. Now, obviously, I couldn't understand it because I didn't know Turkish. But what I did was I asked him, okay, I want to know a bit more about this and this specific subject. And then he would say, well, he talked about it in this and this and this sermon. So he would look it up for me, and we would listen together, and he would explain what Hajj Effendi did, and I would ask all kinds of questions. So what we did was, for the half of the time, we were interviewing these older students of Hajj Effendi, and for the rest of the time, we were together listening to the sermons and discussing what was going on, and I was asking all kinds of questions. So in that sense, it's a little bit unfair that only my name is on the book, because Alper Alassad, my Dutch-Turkish friend, had a really big deal in it. So that was in 2009. We were together a week in Izmir, and then after that I traveled through Turkey with the people of Rumi Forum Maryland chapter. And that's how I started the book. So I wrote a kind of a first draft of the book, and then it was sent to a couple of Turkish people who, well, were supposed to look at it and think if it made any sense. And so it came back to me with a number of remarks, of course, and I rewrote some of it. And then I started with Emre, who was at that moment the director of the Rumi Forum, to discuss, okay, how shall we try to get this published? And Emre said, well, it would be really good if it could be an academic publisher, not just a publisher like other books, but it should really be kind of an academic book. And of course, since I was a professor, well, we had some chances of getting that done, so to say. Now, the interesting thing is this book is published by CUA Press, CUA, the Catholic University of America. This was the first time they ever published about something in Islam. So you can imagine that it cost them some time before they warmed up to the idea. In the beginning they say, well, that's a little bit new, and even though, yeah, you are a Christian theologian, but we've never published about Islam, and you know, well, Islam is always problems, so what are we going to do? Now, I was very happy that apart from the two peer reviewers, because that's what you do, you have two other professors who look through the book and say, okay, it's good enough. There was a third, Sidney Griffith, who was an old friend and colleague of mine in the Department of Semitic Languages. He's a scholar of Syriac and Arabic Christianity. And he knew Hajj Effendi Fethullah Gülen very well. He visited him several times, and you may know not many people get to visit Hajj Effendi, but he went there several times. So he knew him really well. And when they kept saying, well, we're not sure what we will do, I said, well, why don't you ask my friend Sidney, because he really knows him well, and everyone knows Sidney is a priest and he's a very good Catholic theologian. So when Sidney came and said, well, it's really important what Hajj Effendi is doing, you really should publish that, they were in the end convinced. So that's why we get this book. Yeah. But it took 6 years from 2009 until now, well, 7 years almost. Okay, so I think I already told you a little bit about how my book is different from many other books. I think there are more books about what was originally called the Gülen movement, but from the beginning I had a problem with that term, Gülen movement, because I thought it's not about Gülen. And Gülen would be the first to say, no, of course, it's not about me. Gülen would say it's about the volunteers. So Gülen would personally favor the term volunteers movement. But I think it's good that we now have the term Hizmet movement. Hizmet, obviously, you know that better than I, means service. And therefore service is kind of the central theme, the central motive of this movement. And that is why I called the book Renewing Islam by Service, because I think that Hajj Effendi, Fethullah Gülen, gives kind of a new way to live Islam in the world of today. And that's not primarily by, let's say, acting Islam, acting out the pillars of faith. It's not primarily by believing, by doing iman, by believing what Muslims need to do, but it's primarily by being at the service of others. And it is my conviction that you may know there is kind of a tradition in Islamic spirituality that there is a mujaddid, a renewer every now and then in every age. And, well, I'm not the person to say whether Fethullah Gulen is a renewer, but if he is, it is because he institutionalized this idea of doing service as kind of the core business, if you want. And that is why I like the term Hizmet movement. Now, of course, what you do when you research the movement, so I try to read almost everything that has been written about the movement, but almost everything has been written from a sociological perspective about what does the movement look like, what is its political influence, how are the things going on. I wasn't so much interested in that. I was interested in the theological source. So where does it come from? I remember a friend of mine, a Jesuit, has written a very short article on the driver in the mind of Fethullah Gulen. So what drives him to do what he does, and what drives him to inspire others to do what they do. And so I believe, and I found personally the most interesting part, and I remember very well when I was listening to one of these sermons of Hajj Effendi together with Alper, and at a certain moment he started talking about what Hajj Effendi was saying, and I remember that I said to him, wait a moment, you got to repeat what you were saying there. And it was about, in Turkish, Rizayla, in Arabic, Ridwan Allahi. So it is to work for the pleasure of God. That in everything that you do, your deepest motivation is not whether people like it, it's not whether you are successful, but it is whether you work for God's pleasure in such a way that God can be satisfied with you and you can be satisfied about your relationship with God. Now, that's a very deep Sufi term. So if you look at the 4 books that Fethullah Gulen wrote about Sufism, the Emerald Hills of the Heart, I believe, is the title, you will see, and I think it's no coincidence, the article about Ridwan, about Riza, is the longest of all the articles that he has written. So I think, well, that says something. So I found something that, okay, this is why he does what he does. And I think that motivated me to write the book. I found the core, and then the second core that I found, so this is more in the theological thinking of Fethullah Gulen, but what motivates the people who are doing the service, and of course, again, Gulen would be the first to say, it's not about me, but it's about you, it's about the people who are doing the work. And I came across the idea of the sohbet, let's say the conversation among friends on their relationship with God. So it's about their reading together the Quran or the works of Said Nursi, who is very influential in the movement, that motivates them to do the things that they do. And what I found extremely interesting in these sohbets is, on the one hand, it is reading together the sources of your faith, but then there is a business meeting and say, okay, what are we going to do? What's the plan? How can we help? What are the questions that we can answer? So this is a little bit about, I think, what I found to be some of my core findings, if you want. One last thing I want to say is, and that's of course also why in the end I was able to convince COA Press that this might be a good book, because I said, well, I want to do it as a Catholic theologian. So I'm a Christian theologian, I'm Catholic, and I look at the Hizmet movement as a Catholic. So I don't look as a outsider, even though, well, of course you can discuss, am I a part of the movement, yes or no? It depends, I think, on how you would define that. But I definitely look at it from the point of view of a Christian theologian. And I think what I discovered, I could discover because I was looking at Hajj Effendi as a Christian theologian. And I remember, Jenna, that you said, when we had a very short conversation, oh, what shall we talk about? That you said, well, what I found remarkable is that you found out that the Quran and the Hadith, so the sources of Islam, are so important for Hajj Effendi, even though he seldom mentions them explicitly. But if you look at the text very closely, you can find how it is influenced by these Muslim sources. And I think that is something, I'm going to look at these kind of things because I am a theologian. Most others who are not theologians will look at other things and will find other interesting things. But this is one of the things that I find. One final thing. So my last chapter is what I call comparative in nature, which means I try to compare some of the characteristics of what I found in, for instance, the sermons of Hajj Effendi, and some of the characteristics in Christian theology and in Christian religious movements. You can see some quite obvious parallels, for instance, between the Hizmet movement and the Jesuits. For instance, the importance of good education. It's not important that it is very Islamic or very Catholic. No, the most important thing is that it is good education. Well, that's true of the Hizmet movement. That is true of the Jesuits. Another thing is this whole idea of service. So service learning, for instance, is big in universities that are sponsored by the Jesuits. So I can find a number of parallels there. There is one parallel, and then I'll stop. There is one parallel that I found very intriguing, and that might be one of the first things that I came across when I looked at the website of Fethullah Gulen. Some of these websites give a very short biography. These go back to an interview that Hajj Effendi gave to an interviewer, in which he tells a bit about his life. One of the questions in this interview, and I remember that the question was on the website, I don't think it's there any longer, but it was in the beginning, why does he cry? Why does he cry? Well, that is because Gulen was known in Turkey at that time as the crying preacher. And there are several stories that the people whom I interviewed tell about that. He said, well, yeah, others were people who preached in such a way that they could get the people in the mosque crying, not because they were sad. Yeah, there is a kind of sadness, but it's kind of they realized their existence as people who try to be faithful to the true faith, but at the same time they realized that they will ever fail in doing that. And therefore there is this kind of feeling of sadness. But Hajj Effendi is the only preacher who cried himself. So he was not only making others cry, but he cried himself. And the question in that interview was, why is that? And Gulen gives kind of an answer of saying, well, I think that is how God made me. He made me kind of weak of heart, if there might be a better translation as that, but it's kind of, I'm very closely attached to everything that happens. And I remember we looked at a sermon at a certain moment when there was something about children dying in war, and Gulen cried and said, when things like this happen, I made the promise that I will never sleep quietly in my bed until these people are liberated, until we have helped to work on the sadness that so many people have. And as believers, you cannot just lay in your bed and have it nice and warm and cozy, because you need to be concerned about everything that happens. Now, okay, I'll stop here, but this was something that I recognized from a tradition in Christian spirituality. In Christian spirituality, this is called the gift of tears. It's a gift given to you by God because it enables you to understand in a deeper way the sorrow that other people are in, and also how you as a human being should try to make a better world, but at the same time, since we are believers, we know that we will not be able to do that on our own, so we need the help of God. And I think that is a very strong motivation to go to the core of your faith and to try to make a better world. So I try to show a little bit of how I think these two things go together, going to the sources and the core of your faith and make the world a little bit better. And I think I recognize that as the particular contribution of Hajj Effendi Fethullah Gülen, and again, that's why my book is called Renewing Islam by Service.
Okay, I'm going to ask a few questions and ask him to elaborate on a couple things, and then I'll hand it over to the audience. And I think that, going back to what you just said, with tears, I think that it's also a sign of your connection either with your community that you're a part of, and the pain that community is like at a more micro level, if you will, and then the greater community, you can go all the way to the world, what the suffering in the world, and how connected one is, because, as we both know, Said Nursi and Fethullah Gülen, Rumi, all connected, and then connected to the one. So I want to just ask you, why do you think it is that Mr. Gülen writes in the way he does, in terms of when he writes implicitly instead of explicitly? I want to just, if you'll allow me, I want to read just an excerpt from your book. This is page 27. The research for this thesis made me aware of the possibility that the influence of sources in a particular text can of course be determined by the number of explicit quotations of this source in the text. But more often, the presence of the source can be discovered at a deeper level by showing how the source determines the very structure and phrasing of the text. You've read Mr. Gülen's works. You understand what I'm talking about. When a source is really influential, the author of the text will often not quote the text as an external source, but use the language of the source only, and only allude to it implicitly, since he or she assumes that the readers of his or her text will be able to discover the references to the source in the allusions. Not so easy. Not so easy.
Okay, yeah. I think you probably took almost the most difficult quotation that you...
Sorry.
No. So I think, there are people who say, well, there is some kind of an ambiguity sometimes in the text by Mr. Gülen. On the one hand, you can read them as very explicit Islamic texts. On the other hand, you can read them also as very general texts that, for instance, talk about tolerance, humanity, brother and sisterhood, maybe, love, of course. All of these terms you can read on different levels. And some people think, and I do remember I had a huge debate with someone who said, well, that might be a kind of a ambiguity that plays out politically. I do know that it's kind of a double layer in the text that I think has to do with the way in which the Hizmet movement develops itself. So the Hizmet movement is not a Islamist movement. It is not a movement that wants an Islamic community, that wants everything be governed by the Sharia. I think that's clear. for most people in the Hizmet, their faith is kind of what drives them in their private life, but they don't want it to become something that is necessary for everyone. So you can work together, some people being motivated by their Islamic faith, while others can work together with them who don't have that faith, but want to do this service, this Hizmet, for the human community because of other motivations. And I think this makes it very strong because people with different motivations can work together. So there is an entire debate, I won't go into that, whether it's a faith-based community or a faith-inspired community. And I think there is probably a kind of a development. But I do think if you want, and that's of course what is probably specific of me, I want to go back, so to say, to what drives Mr. Gülen to write what he writes. And I want to look at the Islamic elements in that text, because that's my interest as a theologian. And so probably that is why I'm attentive to that. So one last footnote, it also sometimes creates problems. There are, and I give them in my book, famous stories about the movement in the Netherlands that were interviewed by journalists. And there were people in the Netherlands, you of course know that, I hope, that there are some people nowadays in the Netherlands who are not at all friendly towards immigrants and Muslims specifically. And they found out that the government gives some subsidies to some of the boarding schools. And there were some journalists imported from Turkey with a Turkish political agenda who said, well, yeah, they are indoctrinated. So they need to listen to all kind of war films and see Gülen as their hero, and if they don't want that, they are moved away. So there was kind of a political debate about that, and one of the persons that I know very well, he was asked, okay, are you a member of the movement? And he said, no, I'm not. I might be maybe inspired, but I'm not a member of the movement. And behind him was this shelf with all books by Nursi and Gülen. So the journalist said, well, if you say you don't know him, what's behind you then? And in fact, this is a problem, of course, at least that's what I try to analyze, that is imported from the Turkish political situation, not the present day political situation, I know, which is sad enough. But it's the more the secularist type of political situation in which you could not in public be a believing person. And therefore you had to keep quiet about your faith background. And that's of course still part of the problem there. Okay.
Can you, and I, in a good portion of the book and in the latter chapters, you talk about Rumi and Said Nursi's influence. So we're talking about what is the influence of the man and the impetus for doing, leading the community that he leads and asking and encouraging the acts that they're doing. So the three I can pull out from Said Nursi, and then you discuss them in the book. So addressing disunity, poverty, and ignorance. Maybe we are ignorance, disunity, poverty. It's kind of somewhat clear if you're looking at Hizmet and how it's kind of unfolded over the years.
Yeah.
The influence of this.
Yeah. So I think there are two kinds of influences. On the one hand, there is, you can say, very clearly, of course, a spiritual influence, both of Said Nursi and of Jalaluddin Rumi. It's more the mystical dimension, I would say, in the works of Fethullah Gülen. But there is also the intellectual dimension, and part of that intellectual dimension is the analysis that Said Nursi gives already in his so-called Damascus sermon from 1911, if I remember well, where he says, well, these are the problems in the Muslim world nowadays. And you can see how, and I think it's Thomas Michel, one of the Jesuits, who analyzed this, how Gülen takes over this analysis by Said Nursi in saying, well, the basic problem is ignorance, so we need education. And that is why they began, and that's what began in Izmir, with build schools, not because they are so religious, but because they are giving good education to people who couldn't afford good education before that, and that's why they started with the boarding schools and with the homework classes to get better education. And then the second was to overcome disunity, which was the second part of this analysis, and the dialogue organizations that started from, I think, the 1990s, were kind of a way to overcome this disunity. And then the poverty was the third problem, and that is why you have the charity organizations with Kim Se-Yok Moo starting in the beginning of the new
Much
millennium.
more forward now than it has in the past.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, you're a waiting baby, so I'll hand it over to the audience. Do we have a mic in the audience, or should I give mine up? I can. That's not a problem. I see a hand.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. My name is Semiha, and I'm a sociologist from Turkey, and I also do work on the Hizmet movement from a sociologist perspective. I once wrote or analyzed the movement from a Weberian perspective, actually, from the Protestant work ethics and how Gülen kind of enhanced what people already had in themselves and kind of pushed them to be the best of themselves and thus serve to the community. So I actually want to tie this to your comparison with other most Catholic organizations like San Egidio and Focolare. Actually, I just listened to a talk at the Berkeley Center this Tuesday, a talk about the San Egidio movement and their peace brokering. And as the Journalists and Writers Foundation, I'm a volunteer there too, we organized co-events with the Focolare Foundation in Italy and in Egypt. So we already had, relations with them. And I was wondering, like, these two movements and the Jesuits are quite respected in their communities, both maybe by the secular people and the religious people. At least they did not encounter the problems the Gülen movement or the Hizmet movement followers had in having to hide their faith.
Yeah.
They were respected as religious organizations, and they were maybe coded as faith-based or faith organizations, and then they were respected like that. But I think there's a challenge with the Hizmet, that you cannot really name it as a faith-based movement because it does not invite people to a mosque necessarily or a church type of place. So this aura of like ambiguity creates also fears and insecurity. So when you compare the Hizmet movement with these Catholic movements, how would you see the differences or the reactions they get from the societies they live in? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very complex question because, of course, there are so many variables involved. I would say one of the biggest differences, and I think this is what we more or less see nowadays, is that to a certain extent, well, first of all, it was more difficult for the Hizmet movement coming from an Islamic background to develop in the West without being watched with some suspicion. So that has to do with Islam nowadays, as we all know. Whatever you do, there is always suspicion, and that will not go away. That's one point. The second level is, again, Turkey's secular society and the political movements coming from that. But there is a third, and I'm kind of a little bit hesitant here, but let me nevertheless say it, and maybe if I'm wrong, I will be corrected. I think part of it is also because the movement has been so successful. Not only in Turkey, but worldwide. And I think the best comparison there is with the Jesuits. Now, you may know that the Jesuits were chased out of the country, for instance, from France or from Germany, because they were too successful in educating people in the higher strata of society. So you saw that the politicians in Germany and in France said, we don't want to have the Jesuits anymore, because they they are these secret Catholic organizations. And I guess there is kind of a parallel with what is happening right now with the Hizmet and Erdogan, who is chasing them almost out of the country in a similar way as the Jesuits were chased. So it is in part because of the success, it is in part because they influenced people in all different strata of society. With the Focolare or the San Egidio community, I would say they work on a much smaller scale, and therefore these political counter movements do not become so important. But yeah, it's only partly an answer.
Any question?
Dr. Valkenberg, my name is Fevzi Bilgin. Thank you very much for your talk. I read your book. I like it a lot. You explain very deep issues with plain language. So I have actually a specific question. I want to understand what you're saying in your dedication. It's in Latin. So,
Okay. Right, so yeah, that's a good question. No one asked me that question thus far. So there is a Latin kind of secret dedication. Ignoto Christo inter Turcos, which means to the unknown Christ among the Turks. Okay, what shall we make of that? Well, in fact, I think I give it away somewhere in the book where I say that I have met members of the Hizmet movement. So this is not about Hoc Effendi, but this is about members of the Hizmet movement, and I have one particular person in mind who struck me by his total, let's say, giving himself away in dedication to others. Let me give you an example, which I always really like. I was with this person in a mosque, and I do remember, you may know that people of the Hizmet movement say, when you come to Turkey, you need to bring an extra suitcase, because you will get all kinds of stuff, and people will give things to you, so you need some extra room. So I thought, okay, let me take my old shoes to Turkey so that I can leave them there, and I have some room for other things. So I went with this man to the mosque, and he, as you know, of course, you have to remove your shoes. So he took my shoes, and he brought them back to me, and my shoes were really old. And he was probably thinking, this is not good. So what did he do? He bought a new pair of shoes, and he said, can we please exchange our shoes? I will offer you my shoes, and I will gladly accept your shoes. And of course, I mean, he would never wear my shoes because they were in very bad shape. So in fact, he gave me his shoes that he bought. But he did it in such a nice way, and of course, the not so nice way, when I'm blunt and a Dutchman, I would say, well, these shoes, you really can't wear them anymore. He had his way of doing it. So he reminded me, and there are several people in the Hizmet movement who really reminded me of what Christ is for me as a Catholic, namely someone who gives his life, devotes his life for others. Does that answer your question?
Is there any other question? I would like to ask a question. Hoca Efendi, he is an Islamic scholar, but as far as I observe, he is very influential in Christian world, in Jewish world. What makes him influential and very important, not only in Islamic nation, as well in others?
Okay, yeah. I do think that the most important thing for anyone of any religious group to be influential in groups outside of your own group, because that's what you are asking, is authenticity. So authenticity means if you see someone, and that's again something that everyone whom I interviewed said that immediately he lives in the way in which he preaches. So he does what he says. And his humility, I would think, is probably the most, the thing that convinced me most. So the example that many students give is that Hajj Effendi never wanted to live at the expense of others. So when he came, and I told you he was the teacher in this Kestel Basra school, and he did not want to burden his students by taking a glass of water from him. So when he would take a glass of water, he would pay for it. So I would say, this is kind of a small example, but I would say someone who is authentic and humble represents the best values in our religion. And of course you can think of, I mean, immediately I'm thinking of the present Pope, who took the name of St. Francis, and that makes some sense. And I do remember that when I heard that he took the name, because you know, when a Pope is selected, he chooses a name, and the name is a program. And he was the first of all the popes in 20th century who took the name of St. Francis. And to me that was, I do remember, I exactly knew where I was when I heard that, because I think, now something is happening, because Francis really means something, that things are going to be different. Now, so that's another example, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And just a side note, I mean, when the interview came out after Pope Francis, when he became Pope, he soon after, shortly after, gave an interview to American magazine. And I remember reading that, and I shared it with so many friends, and I said, these men are on they're parallel track. You know, they're on the same. They're walking in the same path, if you will. I mean, this is like you could have told me that was an interview. Many of the things, not everything, obviously, but many of the things that were said, responses that Pope Francis gave, it was beautiful, and so it's wonderful. He's the people's pope, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, so I want to just ask before we close out, practically. So we can't avoid the elephant in the room, I guess, given that we are at the American Turkish Friendship Association Rumi Forum. Our honorary chairman is Mr. Gülen, and you know, this community is obviously having a lot of difficulty in his homeland and in the place where it originated. And today, as a lot of us are aware, the Zaman newspaper was seized by the Turkish government, and today's Zaman, so, as well as Cihan News Agency. So it's really, it's becoming, obviously, or it has been, and it's just, you know, very difficult. But I think what is happening within the community is that there's a lot of self-criticism going on, there's a lot of rethinking going on, how to go forward, what is it, and I think you bring up a lot of good ideas in the book, or you present scenarios that really we all need to think long and hard about, especially in going forward. And so I wanted to kind of tease out or get your opinion or your thoughts. I'm sure you've thought about this, if not a little bit, maybe a lot, given the work that you've done. So.
Yeah, I do think that I just talked about authenticity and humility. I think it's kind of hard to be humble when you are doing very well. And that might have been one of the problems of and I mean, I just had some conversations with some of you about this, so this is not entirely that I thought it out, but I think it might be good when you get storms against you. So I may, if I just may plug this in, that's the reason why when Rumi Forum had its last conference about local initiatives of the Hizmet movement, I think it was 3-4 years ago, I did a presentation together with Albert, this friend of mine from the Netherlands, about weathering the storm. Weathering the storm is what you are doing now. And I think that is what religions have to do time and again to come back to their roots. Because when you are doing very well and things go smoothly, well, that's good. But maybe there is a time that you need to go back to your core business, so to say. And I think the Islamic tradition has a very good virtue, a very good example in the idea of sabr. Sabr, I did a study about it a couple of years ago. It's often translated as patience. I think that's not good. Patience sounds like, well, let's be patient and wait. No, it's endurance. It is weathering the storm. It is, you know that you need to reckon not on the short term, but on the longer term, and you need to, well, get through the winter, so to say. And maybe the most important thing is to not declare the other an enemy, because that is the I'm not, sometimes an English word that just doesn't come. That is something that we easily do all the time. Say, okay, he's the bad man. No, that's not the way to go. Sabr means, okay, you go inside yourself and you trust the good powers that they will have more endurance.